In order to be a top-tier passer and keep that QB1 job, you need to have a firm understanding of defenses and what they're trying to do to stop you from driving down the field. And now that we can play linebacker in the NFL Pro Era 2025 DLC, I thought it'd be a great idea to take a high-level look at the basics of a football defense. While this video will focus on the fundamental understanding of defense, I'll aim to provide more than just surface-level detail. That way, you can leave here with more than just a list of positions and common knowledge. Big shout out to my man Stuart in the Status Pro Discord for asking some great questions and giving me the idea to make this video. So let's jump into a few housekeeping items in the first of 3 videos talking about defense so we can understand the basic alignments and assignments of a football defense.
Here we go.
Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that it can be easy to get into the weeds when talking about football. There are so many different systems, schemes, philosophies, and ways of labeling things. If we recall our 5 W's of storytelling, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, we're going to cover the who, what, and where. Who are the players? What are their responsibilities? Where do they go? We'll touch on some of the why for things, but we're going to avoid the how.
Nope.
Otherwise, this video could easily be over an hour long. So now that we've managed expectations, let's dive into how to read these diagrams and what a defense actually is. Let's start with a note about these bubbles in defensive diagrams. This is just an illustration to demonstrate an area a defender is meant to cover for clarity purposes. It does not mean that the defender is going to the center of that bubble, and if a receiver runs to the outside edge of the bubble, then the defender's just gonna let him go.
Well, what's the problem?
There's some kind of force field.
So how do we read this? First, we have these little bubbles that represent the players. Here's the defensive line, here are the linebackers, and here is the secondary. We're going to learn a lot more about those positions later. Up top, we have the personnel, which is which players on the offense are in the game. Next, we have the formation, which is where are they supposed to line up. And from there, we have the play call. Then we have a drawing of what the players are meant to do to execute this play call. These white dots representing the defensive line are meant to rush the passer. These turquoise dots representing the linebackers are supposed to charge down to the area in the bubble and guard anyone who comes near them. The yellow and blue dots are the secondary, and they're supposed to run to their area and defend against any receivers who enter their area. Now, in my opinion, the diagrams on the wristband in NFL Pro Era should be flipped, so they're oriented to how you're facing. So now that we're on the same page as far as these diagrams go, let's dive into what a defense actually is. Simply put, the defense are the 11 players trying to prevent the offense from scoring. There are 3 levels to a defense. Each level has a number of players in it with their own responsibilities depending on the type of defensive play call. The first type of play call is man-to-man, or simply just man coverage. This is where a defender is assigned a particular eligible receiver to cover once the ball is snapped. Once the ball is snapped, there are a number of different man coverage techniques that these defenders can deploy, but it's a little beyond the scope of this video. However, I will say that in NFL Pro Era, the defenders play what is called Meg coverage, or man everywhere he goes. In other words, that's your guy, follow him wherever he runs. The second type of play call is zone coverage. This is where defenders will drop to a particular depth and spot on the field, often referred to as a landmark, and defend a certain area. Once someone comes into their area, there are again numerous options for what can happen next, such as sticking to an area and passing off receivers to the next defender, or sticking to a receiver once he enters the defender's area and following him. In NFL Pro Era, the defenders simply drop back into a zone and try to cover anyone that comes into their area before returning to their zone once they're clear. The defense has a simple mission, but rules, techniques, and contingencies are in place to provide answers against an offense. And keep in mind that the defensive AI in NFL Pro Era is pretty simplistic, so if I mention any other defensive rules that the game doesn't show, then I'll just cut in a diagram or some game film to help demonstrate. The first level of the defense is the defensive line. Their primary responsibility is to stop the run and secondarily to beat the offensive lineman in front of them and sack the quarterback. There are 2 common structures to the defensive line. One is with 2 defensive tackles and 2 defensive ends, and the other is with 2 defensive ends and a nose tackle. In addition, some systems will identify whomever is lined up on the center as the nose tackle, regardless of if there are 3 or 4 down linemen. The D-line is our first structure in what is called a front. Fronts describe to us what the box looks like, or how the defenders are trying to control the line of scrimmage. The first number tells us what the D-line is doing. The second number tells us what the linebackers are doing. There can also be structural names like over, under, jam, wide, tight, etc. And then there can be tags for when safeties come down into the box. Again, it's beyond the scope of this video, but I thought I would mention it and put a few examples on the screen. The job of the defensive line is to line up, put their hand in the ground, and attack a certain gap in the offensive line in order to either sack the quarterback or plug up that gap and tackle a running back on a run play.
Nice.
The defensive ends also have a secondary responsibility, to seal the edge. This means to prevent anyone from cutting back and bouncing to the outside, as well as containing the quarterback from attempting to scramble out of the pocket as it collapses on him, as we can see from poor Daniel Jones here. From there, they use techniques like bull rushing and hand-fighting chops in order to get past the offensive lineman in front of them and accomplish their mission. You heard me mention that word gap a second ago. A gap is the space between the offensive linemen, and they're most commonly labeled using the letters A through D. The A gap is between the center and the guards. The B gap is between the guard and the tackle. The C gap is on the outside of the tackle and in the inside of a tight end if there is one. And the D gap is outside of the tight end, again, if there is one. Some teams will denote one side with capital letters and the other side with lowercase letters to differentiate the weak side and the strong side gaps, while others will use -A, -B, etc. to denote the strong and the weak side. Defensive linemen also have different techniques, or where they align relative to the offensive lineman in front of them. We aren't going to get into the specific labeling of the D-lineman techniques, but I put a pretty common way of doing so up on the screen. Suffice it to say that we refer to where they line up in front of an offensive lineman as a shade. They can be head up or right in front of them. They can be shaded to the offensive lineman's outside shoulder relative to the ball, and they can have an inside shade on the O-lineman's inside shoulder relative to the ball. Where they line up often coincides with which gap they're responsible for. So let's say we're this defensive tackle and we're going to line up against this offensive guard. If we're head up on him, which is called a 2 technique, then the offense has a 50-50 guess as to which gap we're attacking. If we move to his inside shoulder, which is called a 2-eye technique, then the offense can guess that we are attacking this weak side A gap. And if we line up on his outside shoulder, which is called a 3 technique, then the offense can guess that we're probably responsible for this weak side B gap. There are numerous different ways to organize and shuffle the defensive line to create what is called a front, and there are quite a few of them. To keep things simple, we're only going to talk about 3: an even front, an odd front, and a bare front. The 3 interior offensive linemen are referred to as the core. We use the shades on the core to tell us what category of front we are facing. If there are an even number of D linemen covering the core with their hand in the ground, then we have an even front. And it can be any combination of shades and techniques. If there's only one D lineman, usually a 0 technique or somewhere between a 0 and a 1, called a tilted 1, then we have an odd front. Finally, if all 3 offensive linemen of the core are covered, then it is a bare front. Specifically, this is called a jam front. What makes it a true bare front is having the core covered, the linebackers to the same side, and the strong safety down in the box. This comes from the 1980 Chicago Bears under defensive coordinator Buddy Ryan, hence the name Bear. And they called it a 46 front or a 46 defense because the safety they brought up was Doug Plank, whose jersey number was 46. But we'll just call it Bear since we're talking about the core. A link to a video of Rob Ryan talking about the 46 defense is in the description and in the card above. To wrap up the defensive line, we will add the ends and get a count of how many D linemen there are. Usually, there are 3 or 4 D linemen. Sometimes there are 2. We're going to build on that in a moment to something you might be familiar with already. That brings us to the second level, the linebackers. The combination of linemen and linebackers is called the box, which is commonly defined as a few yards outside the width of the offensive line and the depth of the linebackers. These are the players that can most immediately impact the running game. Often, the linebackers are called Mike, Will, and Sam when the line is in an even front with 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers. And when we have an odd front with 3 down linemen, we typically have 4 linebackers called Mike, Sam, Will, and Buck. I've seen this 4th linebacker be called a lot of different things, Jack or Mo for the other middle. But I like calling him Buck because it has B for backer, so we'll stick with that. Sam is the strong side linebacker, often the side with the tight end or the side with more receivers depending on the defensive system. Both Strong and Sam start with S. Sam is usually the better run stopper. Will is the weak side linebacker, often the side without the tight end, or fewer receivers. Will and weak start with W. Will is likely the faster and better in coverage of the linebackers. The Mike linebacker is the middle of the 3 linebackers, and his nickname is the quarterback of the defense because he's usually the one getting the defensive play call through the helmet radio and calls the play to the defensive huddle. Mike and middle both start with M. Plus, the Mike linebacker usually has the mic in his helmet. When we add the linebackers to our 3 down linemen and our 4 down linemen, we get the numerical names of different defenses you've likely heard before. So 4 linemen and 3 linebackers is called a 4-3 defense, and 3 linemen and 4 linebackers is called a 3-4 defense. As their name implies, linebackers back up the defensive line. So the linebacker's primary job is to fill any gap that has been left over from the defensive line's shades. That way, the defense is prepared to plug up any of the gaps and stop the run. In order to stop the run, defenses want to be gap sound, meaning every gap in the offensive line is accounted for. Let's take a look at an even front. This one in particular is an over front with the 3 tech to the tight end side. By the way, linebackers have technique numbers too, but again, we aren't going to dive that deep into it. But don't worry, there's a video coming out all about the fundamentals of linebacker techniques and playing linebacker in NFL Pro Era 2025. For our purposes here, suffice it to say that the linebackers in the running game are responsible for the gaps not covered by the defensive linemen. Here we have our strong and weak side gaps and our linebackers. Our D-line has left a bubble over the center and are in what is called a wide front. Since we have a balanced formation on offense with a single running back in the middle and 2 tight ends, I'm assigning this strength to our left since, looking at the hash marks, the wide side of the field is that way. Our D-end is on the outside shoulder of the tight end, so he will attack the strong side D gap. Our 3 tech will attack the strong side B gap. Our other 3 tech will attack the weak side B gap. And the right D-end will attack the D gap. From there, Sam can account for the strong side C gap. Will can fit into the weak side C gap, and Mike can read the running back to tell him which A gap to fill. Looking at this 34 front, our D-end is head up on the tackle in a 4 technique, so he can go either way. So let's have him take the strong side B gap. Our nose tackle is head up on the center in a 0 technique, and he can go either way, so we'll have him attack the weak side A gap. And our right D-end is head up, so we will have him attack the weak side C gap. Sam can account for the strong side D gap, Will can take the weak side D gap, Mike can fit into the strong side A gap opposite the nose tackle, and Buck can fill the weak side B gap. As for the remaining C gap, we can walk a safety down into the box to fit into that. That gives us a very simplistic introduction into the concept of run fits, meaning where a defender fits into defending against a run play. In a real defense, linebackers could have a single gap responsibility, or they could have a 2 gap responsibility with rules for where to go if the run play comes to them, or where to go if it flows away from them. They will also read keys to tell them if it's a run or a pass play and where they should fit in as well. There'll be more on keys in the upcoming linebacker video. Next, they can be responsible for defending against the pass. In man coverage, they're assigned to cover a specific eligible receiver, usually a running back or a tight end, or what's called a spy when they're assigned to watch a quarterback that may be a running threat. Often, the Will and Sam would be responsible for covering a tight end or even a slot receiver, and the Mike would be responsible for the running back. Buck is often the 4th rusher in a 3-4 defense, but not always. Or the linebacker is responsible for dropping into an area of the field and covering anyone that comes in that area in zone coverage. Mike usually covers the short middle or the hole area. Will, the weak side hook area. and Sam the strong side hook area, while Buck brings pressure, but again, not always. Finally, they can be assigned to rush the quarterback by attacking a certain gap in an attempt to pick up a sack. If one or more linebackers bring pressure, we can't just leave that area open for the offense to attack, right? Someone needs to cover their voided area. That brings us to the last level of the defense. The third level, commonly referred to as the back end of the defense, is made up of defensive backs, sometimes referred to as the secondary. These are your coverage guys, typically 2 cornerbacks and 1 or 2 safeties. The back end is responsible for covering wide receivers and defending the deeper portions of the field. These back end defenders create what is called the shell of the defense. Cornerbacks are responsible for covering the receivers on the outside of the offense. They can play either on the left side or right side exclusively, or they can travel and be assigned to the boundary or the field. Remember, the wider side is referred to as the field side, and the more narrow side is referred to as the boundary. This means they can flip-flop to their assigned side whenever the ball switches hash marks. Or, if it's a good matchup, they could be assigned to follow a specific receiver throughout the game or even on certain downs. In zone coverage, they can most often be responsible for a deep third or deep fourth of the field or the flat area depending on the coverage call. They can sometimes be responsible for a deep half of the field in what's called invert, where they switch responsibilities with a safety. And of course, they can be asked to blitz the quarterback in what's sometimes called a cat blitz, C for cornerback. There are certain techniques that cornerbacks use when lining up against a receiver. These include bump or press, and loose or off. Where they align relative to a wide receiver can be called a shade, like the defensive line, but you'll mostly hear it described as leverage. So, a cornerback aligned to the outside shoulder of the wide receiver is said to have outside leverage, and it's understood that he's attempting to protect the outside of the defense while attempting to funnel the wide receiver toward his safety help inside. Similarly, if he has inside leverage, it's understood that he's trying to protect the intermediate to deep middle of the field by attempting to funnel the wide receiver to his outside safety help, as well as use the sideline as an extra defender. And of course, he can always be head up. We talked about the Mike linebacker being the one to call the play to the huddle. The cornerbacks can be assigned to call out wide receiver splits, or how far apart the receivers are aligned against the called coverage. Next are the safeties. They are called safeties because they are the safety net, the last line of defense for the defense. They can sometimes be asked to play man-to-man, or even blitz from the heavens. But typically, one or both of the safeties will drop into a zone regardless of the coverage underneath. But which safety and how many of them drop depends on the coverage call. There are typically 2 kinds of safeties: a strong safety to the strong side, and a weak safety, who is often called the free safety, to the weak side. Like cornerbacks, they're often asked to go to their respective side depending on the offensive strength. The strong safety is usually the one that teams will walk down into the box and get involved in the running game. Some would consider them to be safety linebacker hybrid type players, because he can help in the run game as well as cover slot receivers or even running backs in certain man coverages. As for the free safety, he's usually the one who drops into coverage when the defensive play call requires only one safety to go deep. In which case, teams want their free safety to be fast, so he can cover sideline to sideline over the top. As far as communication responsibilities, safeties can be assigned to call out the personnel, down and distance, and where the offensive strength is. Against the run, corners and safeties support via an outside in and take a deeper angle of pursuit, given their depth at the snap. With an emphasis on passing in the modern game of football, offenses can and will put more wide receivers on the field at the expense of a fullback for most teams. In order to counter this, defenses will make a switch as well. They will often swap out a linebacker or a lineman in exchange for another DB, bringing the DB count up to 5. This is called substitute or simply just sub personnel, more commonly referred to as a nickel defense. So called because a nickel is worth 5 cents and there are 5 DBs on the field. This nickel could be called the money or the star. The primary reason teams do this is to get a better matchup against the speed of a wide receiver, which would often be a pretty big mismatch if you put a linebacker on him. We can add to what we learned earlier about labeling the 4-3 and the 3-4. When in sub, a 3-4 defense becomes a 3-3-5, or a 2-4-5 if they swap out a lineman. And a 4-3 becomes a 4-2-5. Swapping again gives us a dime defense, the next coin up from a nickel. Swapping again gives us quarter, and swapping again gives us dollar. Nickel is the most common by far, followed by dime. Quarter and dollar are used far less often. Usually reserved for when an offense is backed up on the field at the end of a game and the defense need to ensure that they need to keep everything in front of them and let the clock expire. The last quick point I want to make before we wrap up this video is the difference between pressure and blitz. While any system can call anything whatever they want, I'm used to defining a blitz as a rush from a member of the secondary, like a safety, whereas pressure is one of the linebackers or someone down in the box rushing the quarterback. When a linebacker is rushing the quarterback, you might hear it called dog pressure. So all dog means all the linebackers are bringing pressure, or strong dog to indicate a strong side Sam linebacker is rushing. We talked about a cat blitz earlier when talking about cornerbacks. And there are also names for when multiple rushers are coming, like wolf for a will and a free safety on an outside blitz, or saw for the Sam and the will bringing pressure together. It's semantics, really, and can be system and scheme specific, but I wanted to make sure to touch on all of that so we're on the same page when we're talking about these defenses. And we made it! To sum it up, the defense is trying to prevent the offense from advancing and ultimately prevent them from scoring. They do this first by stopping the run, by being gap sound at the first two levels, and building a coverage on the back end that attempts to gain a numbers advantage to each side of the offense. Defensive linemen are the primary run defenders and secondary pass rushers. The linebackers have to read their keys to tell them whether they are going to defend against the run or the pass. And we have the secondary backing everybody up deep. I hope you were able to get a good grasp on the basics of a football defense. Leave a like if you learned something new, and comment if you know something we talked about by a different name. I love hearing stuff like that. And stay tuned for the next video in the series all about playing linebacker in NFL Pro Era 2025. See you next time.